And occasionally new ones of these are found. Here's the largest bacterium that's ever been discovered. This was a year or two ago. And this is Thiomargarita magnifica. And it was described as a magnificent megabacterium. It's about 2 centimeters long. And the V in the middle, this is the cytoplasm, and the V in the middle is a vacuole. So there's really nothing happening in the middle of it. Here you can see it. This is a very thin film of cytoplasm around it, and a giant vacuole, and this is a close-up of the same thing. Look at this, 36,000 genomes per millimeter. That's to say about 750,000 genomes in this 2-centimeter cell. It's called extreme polyploidy. And all known giant bacteria have this extreme polyploidy. And if you add up the costs of having thousands and thousands of copies of a complete genome, none of those genomes can afford to be very large. They all have to be quite compact. Otherwise, it would never work. So they're really limited. And you can calculate these things. I'm not going to talk about this. This was from our paper from 15 years ago. And you can calculate Thiomargarita, Euglena, E. coli, and so on. If you do it per gram of cells, then E. coli does much better. But if we do it per gene or per genome, then E. coli and Thiomargarita have hardly any energy at all in comparison to our kind of cell. So we've got these internalized power packs, and that's what led to this revolutionary new trajectory in the whole history of life. There's always a but. So eukaryotes arose around 2 billion years ago, and animals which we, I suppose, being human, care most about, didn't arise until about 550 million years ago. So why the long delay? There's a 1.5 billion year delay, and so I'll try and do animals in the last 5 minutes or so. This is what's known as the Cambrian explosion, and it's also been called Darwin's dilemma. It worried Darwin quite a lot, but there's a fossil record that goes back to the Cambrian, and there's amazing animals found in the Cambrian period around about 520, 550 million years ago. So trilobites that most people will have heard of, trilobites with stunning eyes, these compound eyes, really astonishing fossilization as well. And here is a thing called hallucigenia. But there's all these beasts from the Cambrian period, and the reason it's called Darwin's dilemma is that they appear quite abruptly in the fossil record. Around about 550 million years ago at the beginning of the Cambrian. Before that, there are other fossils called the Ediacaran fauna that go back to about 570 million years ago. And before that, there's really nothing. There are bacteria, there are some strange things, but really nothing very much. So it appears very abruptly. I would say in broad brushstroke that over the last 20 years or so, most people, based on genetic reconstructions, assumed that animals had appeared much earlier, perhaps 1 billion years ago, and hadn't fossilized properly for whatever reason. And so there was a long fuse to the Cambrian explosion, and this explosion was really a change in the conditions in the oceans that led to this. Well, it seems that that's not true. It seems that it really was an explosion. There really wasn't anything out there before about 580 million years ago. And before that, we've got plenty of fossils of protists and of algae and of fungi and of bacteria, but nothing of animals earlier than that. So they really weren't there. So what was it that suddenly gave rise to animals? Once you have them, once you have oxygen, this is an idea that goes back a long way. If you've got oxygen in the atmosphere, then you can have animals. And specifically, you can have predation. Because if you're just doing fermentation like yeast do, you only get about 10% of the energy value of the food that you eat. So if you have 2 trophic levels in a population, you're down to about 1% of the energy in the system within 2 trophic levels. Whereas if you're doing aerobic respiration, you get about 40% out, which means you can have 5 trophic levels before you get down to the same thing, which means as soon as you've got oxygen, you can have predation, you can have predators and prey in ecosystems that we know. And that's really what we're looking at in the early Cambrian. It's this sudden rise of predators. So then the question is, well, how and when does oxygen come about? This is the Krebs cycle as we know it. These are Cambrian animals, and we can be virtually certain that they would have had a modern Krebs cycle as we know it. So then oxygen, why is it special? It's special in part because it only picks up single electrons. So it reacts with things like iron, and iron will rust for that reason. But carbon will pass on 2 electrons, and oxygen only wants 1. And so there's a kind of a discomfort, if you like, in the chemistry between oxygen and carbon. And what that means is that oxygen can accumulate in the atmosphere to very high levels, and that means that the entire ecosystem can be really highly charged, energetically charged. So where and when does the oxygen come? Well, it comes with photosynthesis, and this is what's happening with photosynthesis. It's taking the electrons from water, from the hydrogen in water, passing them on to CO2 to make organic molecules, and oxygen is the waste product. And respiration, from this point of view, is exactly the opposite. We burn food in oxygen to produce CO2 and water as the waste products. So these are essentially equal and opposite processes, and on a planetary scale, they are amazingly well balanced. The reason that oxygen levels stay at 21% over millions and millions of years is that the rate of respiration exactly balances the rate of photosynthesis. But we know 2 billion years ago there wasn't really any oxygen, so we know it changed over Earth history. So when did it change, and how do we know? Well, basically, if what we're doing is burning food in oxygen, if you can protect this, if you can sequester it out of the way, bury it in the ground as coal, then it's no longer oxidized by oxygen. So this oxygen that would have been burning that now is left over in the atmosphere. So you can work out from the amount of carbon that gets buried in the Earth how much oxygen would be left over in the atmosphere. But effectively, this is actually, it's to do with carbon isotopes that we can tell how much was buried. All I want you to notice is that when this goes up, more oxygen is in the atmosphere. When it goes down, there's less oxygen. And this is a period known as the boring billion, between about 2 billion years ago and 1 billion years ago, where really nothing much was going on. And then here, the Cambrian explosion is about there, oxygen levels going up again. But look at this, 2 massive dips. Now, this is the reconstruction. This is a famous figure from a Nature paper that shows here oxygen goes up, there's a bit of an overshoot, it goes down again. It's a little difficult to constrain through here, and then here it goes up, and we've got a little bubble around the time of the Carboniferous period where all the coal was being buried in the Carboniferous. But notice that they've decided to ignore these 2 big downturns. They just drew a line through it, don't worry about that. This goes on a lot in science, by the way. I mean, if we don't know how to explain this, we just ignore it. Someone will come up with a good explanation sometime. Well, it's actually, what this says is oxygen levels were going down during this little bit, or potentially going down. When oxygen starts rising, we go from what is this reverse Krebs cycle, where we're pulling in hydrogen, we're pulling in CO2, and we're making organic molecules. First 2 to 3 billion years of life on Earth, we're making organics from the Krebs cycle. Then oxygen levels rise, and what does it do? Does it screech to a halt, turn around, and now start going the other direction? You kind of think, as a biochemist, whoa, what just happened there? Well, it turns out, to reference another talk on the disappointment of revolutions, there is a way. You simply split it into 2 prongs. One prong does one thing, the other prong does the other thing, and you kind of balance everything that way. So there's always a solution in biochemistry. And it may seem a little bit of a dull solution. But what it's basically doing is allowing you to keep a balance of the various players going on. And that's what was happening right before the Cambrian explosion. These are the first trace fossils that have been discovered. So a trace is basically, this is a trace. You've got a worm going through the mud, and it leaves a track behind it, a trace behind it. And so these are the first trace fossils of these first worm-like things that were crawling through the mud in really sulfidic conditions. This is the time when one of those big down sweeps where all the oxygen was being sucked out was happening around then. So how did they manage to do that? Here's one piece of evidence. This is from the Permian extinction 250 million years later, but it's sometimes been called the key to what happened in the Cambrian. This is the extinction. This is 250 million years ago. These are groups of animals that move around, that ventilate their respiratory system. They crawl in the mud. These guys are mostly sessile filter feeders. Think of sponges and corals and things that just stick to the bottom. So going through these various periods, they're all doing, the C-cell filter feeders, there's more of them than there are of these guys. At the Permian extinction, they crash right down, they're almost completely wiped out and they never recover again. Whereas these guys that are crawling through the mud, they still take a hit, but not nearly as bad as these guys, and they recover straight away. So after the Permian extinction, we have a complete shift in ecosystems. And this is exactly what seems to have been happening at the beginning of the Cambrian. We go from these sessile filter feeders, the Ediacaran fauna, we go through this big dip in oxygen. They all get wiped out, and the crawlers become these vertebrates. And now we have an oxygenated world where predation pays, and all of these things, they've got teeth, they've got claws, they've got eyes, they've got armor plating, and so on. So there's a lot to do with oxygen, but it's not just a plain oxygen levels went up and suddenly we see a hypercharged world. We go through this period where the people who are, the animals that are somehow dealing with really sludgy, sulfidic, nasty conditions, the ones that can ventilate their respiratory systems are the ones that survive these horrible conditions, and then there's a planet waiting for them to inherit. But another, just coming to an end, this is the time the eukaryotes first arose. This is roughly what the oxygen levels were like then. Here's when they go up around the time of the Cambrian, and again, perhaps even more in the Carboniferous period. And this is the oxygen tension that we have in our tissues and that crabs have in their arteries and so on. It's basically very, very similar. It's very low. We keep our oxygen levels really low inside our tissues, apparently very deliberately. And it reminds me of Joseph Priestley, who's often attributed as the discovery of oxygen, who said, a moralist at least may say that the air which nature has provided for us is as good as we deserve. An evolutionary biologist may say that it's what we've adapted to. And Priestley, I just want to finish with this idea. Priestley, in fact, anticipated the free radical theory of aging by about 300 years, 200. He said, for as a candle burns out much faster in dephlogisticated, that means air with more oxygen, than in common air, so we might, as may be said, live out too fast, and the animal powers be too soon exhausted in this pure kind of air. So if you're breathing pure oxygen, then effectively a candle will burn out very quickly, and he's saying that animals that are suddenly breathing pure oxygen are going to age and die faster. And those Cambrian animals that were appearing in an oxygenated world, this is the beginning. We see that, the beginnings of why we have aging in life. It's how are you dealing with oxygen? How are you dealing with your Krebs cycle? And this is the very final slide that I would like to show you, because this is about the 100th anniversary of Otto Warburg, who came up with an explanation for cancer. Otto Warburg was actually Krebs's mentor, and managed to survive as a Jew in Nazi Germany during the 1930s because he told Hitler that he had a cure for cancer, and Hitler apparently was morbidly terrified of cancer. And of course, he didn't cure cancer, but anyway. But this has become known as the Warburg effect. What he said is that cancer cells kind of revert to a primitive phenotype, and instead of breathing oxygen, they just ferment. Now, that's not really true. But if you think about these processes at the level of the Krebs cycle, what they're actually doing, as we get older, respiration does get worse, not at the level of can we breathe in and out physically, but how does respiration in the mitochondria work, and the charges on this membrane begin to get lower, and we begin to make less ATP, we have less energy, and then the Krebs cycle begins to start to turn and go the other way. So we still have inside us this revolution this way or that way. Which way is it going to be? This is going on in a lot of our cells as we get older all the time. I can feel it happening in me right now. So why would it want to do that? In cancer cells, because cancers don't need the energy. What they need are the molecules. They need amino acids, they need sugars, they need nucleotides. They want to grow, they want to proliferate. And so cancer cells very often are picking out the kind of metabolism from the Krebs cycle that was going on in methanogens at the origin of life, and the first 2 billion years of life history. It's still happening now in our own tissues. And this is this has become quite big over the last 10 years or so, the realization that a way of targeting cancers is not only about which genes have got mutations, it's also about how is metabolism working and what can we do to try and correct that metabolism. I worry about these things. I think about these things. The best thing I can really do is what my grandmother no doubt would have told me, which is to go for a run and eat my greens. And that's about as good as it gets.